All right, hello guys, Miss Sullivan here. Today we're going to be looking at Star Wars and the hero's journey. So I know that earlier in the week we looked at Bulger's 12 steps of the hero's journey and how it applies to the Odyssey. But as we're going through this presentation today, I want you to be prepared to compare Luke's journey in Star Wars to Odysseus's journey in the Odyssey. So what similarities do you see? What differences do you see? And just to kind of a brief overview of what those 12 steps are. One is the ordinary world. This is where the protagonist starts off in. He finds a call to adventure. Initially, he refuses the call because he's scared or doesn't want to go, but then he meets with a mentor who eventually helps him cross over that threshold into this newer world. After crossing the threshold, he comes across various tests in which he finds his allies and his enemies. And after that, together with the allies, he approaches the innermost cave. As he's approaching, he comes across an ordeal, which is an attempt at a big change, which he then gets a reward, which is, the consequences of that ordeal. On the road back, he has a rededication to change. And finally, the resurrection is the last attempt at a big change, in which case he can return back home with that elixir. So those are just, a brief overview of the 12 steps, and now we're going to go through them through Star Wars. So first is the ordinary world. In a galaxy far, far away, we find Luke on Tatooine, and Luke feels that his life on Tatooine is unfulfilled. He wants to be more than just a small world farm boy. And as you guys will recall, the ordinary world is supposed to kind of represent a limited awareness of this larger problem that Luke faces, or, the Republic. And then is the call to adventure. So Luke buys this drone and he finds Leia's message in R2-D2. So he kind of sets out to find Obi-Wan or Ben Kenobi to deliver this message to him. So as you guys remember, call to adventure is supposed to be the increased awareness or the initial encounter with something beyond the ordinary world. So this is his first interaction with the rebellion. So then the protagonist meets with the mentor. So Luke is rescued by Obi-Wan Kenobi, and in meeting this mentor, he's supposed to kind of overcome some reluctance to the ordinary world. Now, as you guys will recall, the third step is supposed to be the refusal to the call. That in Star Wars is actually flip-flopped with the fourth step, the meeting with the mentor. And I just wanted to point this out to you guys to let you know that it's okay if the 12 steps don't line up exactly. So think about that when you're doing your final projects later this week. And then is the refusal to the call. So there is a reluctance to change. So Luke at first refuses, believing that his aunt and uncle are going to need him on the farm. However, he eventually crosses this threshold. So he really has to commit to the change after he discovers his aunt and uncle were killed by the stormtroopers. After this, he goes across some minor tests where he meets his allies and his enemies. So Jabba the Hutt and the stormtroopers and Darth Vader are his enemies, whereas his allies are C-3PO, Chewbacca, Han Solo, and R2-D2. And then, so the tests and allies were kind of experimenting with a first sort of big change, but as you approach to the innermost cave, you're really preparing for a bigger change. So Luke and his allies are journeying to the Death Star to eventually try and find Leia. And that is then the ordeal. Once they get to the Death Star, they rescue Leia. Now, this is kind of the attempt at a big change. So while rescuing Leia is, a big act, it's the act that they were going for, it's not as big as, say, taking down the Death Star, which, not to foreshadow what comes later, but then is the reward. So Leia is rescued. However, with this reward comes the cost. Obi-Wan sacrifices himself under the hand of Darth Vader and becomes part of the Force, for those of you who have not seen Star Wars. So and the reward is really supposed to be the consequences of the ordeal. So while we gained Leia, we lost Obi-Wan, which then kind of segues into the road back. So the road back is supposed to be a rededication to the change. So it was kind of, for Luke, catalyzed by Obi-Wan's death. And on the road back, they discover that the Death Star has moved in range of the rebellion and is preparing to shoot. So this is, again, a rededication of the cause. He has to go back out and fight. And then is the resurrection. So the resurrection is supposed to be a final attempt at a big change. So in Star Wars, Luke uses the Force. He hears Obi-Wan Kenobi's voice in his head telling him to trust the Force, to trust himself, and he uses this to destroy the Death Star. So this is the big change. And then he returns with the elixir. So the return is supposed to be the final mastery of the problem. And in this case, while I know there are other movies, the big change is that they did destroy the Death Star, and Luke and his allies are decorated now as, decorated leaders of the rebellion. And Luke now has a new self-knowledge and control over the Force. All right, so I know that was kind of fast, guys, but I want you to think back on any connections that you might have made between Odysseus's journey and Luke's journey. And then you guys are going to be taking a small quiz. You're going to see that over to the side on the website. Just go through that quiz. Feel free, if you need to, go through this video as many times as you need to answer those questions. But the most important question is going to be the comparison of Star Wars and the Odyssey in terms of Luke's journey and Odysseus's journey. And then I also want you to be thinking big picture now. So this Vogler's 12 Steps of a Hero's Journey can be applied to many stories. So I want you guys to think of your own story that you know of, like Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings, that you can apply the 12 steps to the hero's journey towards. And these are going to be your final projects. Now, if you're having any trouble, try and think back to any fantasy novels that you might have read or sci-fi. But if you really need help, then come see me. All right, thank you guys. I'll see you in class tomorrow.